know it's been a little while since I've posted a new lesson. Sorry for the delay on this one. It was a bit to wrap my head around how best to explain it. So what we're going to talk about is cell size and what kinds of things limit cell size. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're talking about how big cells are, so let's talk about the general ranges of them. Prokaryotic cells can range anywhere from 0.5 to 10 micrometers, and 1 micrometer, that's a micro symbol with the little tail on the front of the U, is 1/1 millionth, gotta count my zeros, of a meter. So super tiny. And then a eukaryotic cell is going to be anywhere from 10 to 100 micrometers. So they can be anywhere from 100 to 10 times bigger, maybe even 200 times bigger than a prokaryotic cell. And if you're thinking, it's been a while since freshman bio, don't remember the difference, just remember that prokaryotic cells are unicellular bacteria that lack a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Sorry, forgot a word. Okay? And eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So cells have an upper limit to how big they can grow. So let's talk about what limits that cell size. And before you start geeking out, hopefully, about what all is in this diagram, this is a kind of 3D-ish image produced by some labs in Harvard that's trying to show the reality of how complex and how busy and just how crowded the cytoplasm of a cell is. So remember, molecules, once they get into a cell, they don't get transferred around purposefully. They tend to move through diffusion, which is a passive process that the cell doesn't use energy for. There aren't any cars, there aren't any little motors moving most of this stuff around. So the rate at which these molecules diffuse depends on a few things. The fact that it's very crowded in the cytoplasm. In fact, you can have, even just with the water alone, you can have a single molecule or protein undergo like 1 million to 1 billion collisions with water molecules a second. So there's a lot of stuff floating around in the cell, and there's a lot of stuff to run into. Then some molecules will aggregate or stick together, which is going to impede their movement, and size is going to play a factor. So the larger a molecule is, the slower it's going to diffuse through the cytoplasm, just because, think about it. If you have a very big molecule, it's going to be harder for it to make its way through all these organelles. But if you have a smaller molecule, it can kind of fit past some of these organelles a lot easier. So it's going to take larger molecules more time to move through this crowded cytoplasm. A typical protein takes about 0.01 seconds to cross a bacterial cell with an average length of about 1 micrometer. And that, if you think about it, would end up meaning that that same protein would take about 4 minutes to move 1 millimeter and about 6 hours to move 1 centimeter. So that just gives you an idea of the scale of how long it takes to move across some of these distances. So it helps to have smaller cells so that molecules can get from one side of a cell to another. Another limitation is the plasma membrane, and it's going to be a big focus of this lesson and the next couple. So let's talk about it real quick. The plasma membrane or cell membrane's job is to help exchange materials between the cell and the environment. And to kind of give you an estimate of how big the plasma membrane is, we use a measurement of surface area, which we're going to talk about a couple of times. So the surface area of a plasma membrane has to be big enough to allow enough material to enter. Like here we see a bunch of hexagons, which if you don't remember, those are going to be glucose molecules. And then here we see a bunch of CO2. And notice the glucose molecules need to be transported into the cell because they're the source of energy. And the CO2 molecules are a waste product, so those need to be removed from the cell. So this has to do with not just surface area. So the surface area of a cell is how much space, how much square area it has to move materials in and out of the cell. But then you also have to keep in mind that the volume of the cell is going to impact how much material needs to move in and out of the cell. So the surface area and volume ratio is going to affect how cells can obtain nutrients, eliminate waste products, acquire or release energy, especially heat energy. So that surface area to volume ratio is going to be something we talk about quite a bit in this lesson. So the surface area to volume ratio forms an upper limit on how big a cell can get. So here we see a calculation for two different size cubes, 1 unit on a side and then another one that's 5 times as big, so 5 units on a side. If you use the formula length times, height times width times number of sides, then what you're going to get for the surface area of this smaller cube is it's got a surface area of 6 square units. Then it's got a volume of 1 times 1 times 1, length times width times height. And that is going to be 1. So the surface area to volume ratio is going to be 6 to 1, or you can just divide that out, and it turns out to be 6. With the cube that's 5 times larger, the calculation for the surface area is going to be 6 times width times height, which is going to be 150. And then the calculation for volume, length times width times height, is going to be 125. When you do the ratio of those, 150 to 125, and you divide that out, you get a surface area to volume ratio of 1.2. So notice that the surface area to volume ratio starts decreasing. And here you see a different set of cubes where instead of having one giant cube, you have a bunch of smaller cubes. And notice that that allows you to maintain a larger surface area to volume ratio. So instead of having one giant cell with a low surface area to volume ratio, you can fit a bunch of cells in there and they will have a larger surface area to volume ratio, very similar to what the original cell had. So if a cell is smaller, it's got a higher surface area to volume ratio, which means it's able to more efficiently get materials into and out of the cell. And as the cell volume increases, not only do you decrease the surface area to volume ratio, which means it's harder to get materials in and out of the cell, but since the cell is bigger, it just has a higher demand for resources. The more volume you have in a cell, the more ATP it's going to need, the more glucose it's going to need, the more oxygen it's going to need, the more CO2 that you're going to need to release, the more building blocks of proteins that you're going to need to get into the cell. So that you're going to have a bigger demand on a smaller ratio of surface area of plasma membrane to volume. So these are the relevant formulas that you might end up using for a question like this on the AP test. This is directly screenshotted from the formula chart, although I haven't screenshotted what it looks like in the reference materials in Blue Book. So you have the volume for surface area of a sphere, volume of a sphere, surface area of a rectangular solid. So notice you have the surface area of various shapes and then the volume of those shapes. And then you have your key right here telling you what each of those measurements is. I will admit, I cannot remember having seen a question that requires you to calculate a surface area to volume ratio with these equations on the AP test in my recent memory, although keep in mind, your teachers don't get to see the multiple choice questions because those are confidential. So as far as I know, there might have been one of these pop up. So just make sure you know where these formulas are on the formula chart and that you're able to use them. Let's talk about what you do if you don't have enough space to have a big surface area, or if you want to increase surface area without increasing the volume. One thing you could do is you could start having what are called membrane folds. And so membrane folds are going to let some of these more complex structures have a larger surface area with which to exchange materials back and forth in between one space and another without necessarily increasing the volume. That's also important because something like a mitochondria, what you see up here, it's got that extremely folded membrane because let's say you had, and I've done this demo in class, a sheet of paper. That surface area, that represents the surface area of a membrane. Now in organelles like the mitochondria, membrane is embedded with all these different molecules that are doing a certain job. In the case of mitochondria, they're making ATP. The more membrane you have, the more ATP you can make, but you don't want to take a ton of space for that membrane. What you can then do is you can crumple up that membrane, fold it, and then fit it into a smaller volume. So then you get around that surface area to volume ratio limitation, and you also have more surface area on which you can have these functional proteins. There are some infoldings of the plasma membrane in prokaryotes as well. They just don't tend to fully pinch off and form a new organelle. So what you can kind of see right here, this is actually an infolding of the plasma membrane. So that increases the surface area of membrane that you have without necessarily increasing the volume. Now let's talk about what this surface area to volume ratio, the impact it has on organisms, because it doesn't just affect the size of cells, it affects the size of organisms as well. So if you have this chart, which is giving you an approximation of the size of different organisms. So this looks like a bacterial cell with some flagella. This looks like an amoeba. Here we have a fly, a dog, and a killer whale. And we've got an estimate of their length, their surface area, and their volume. Notice that for the really tiny organisms, they have a huge surface area to volume ratio. For the ginormous organisms, they have a much smaller surface area to volume ratio. So this affects things like how much heat can you exchange with the environment. So if you're trying to get rid of a lot of heat, so for instance, if you're like an elephant living in Africa, elephants are very large animals, and the tropical areas they live in Africa tend to have higher temperatures. So they would want to be releasing heat into their environment so that way they don't overheat. Well, since they're larger animals, that becomes difficult, and then they have to have adaptations that allow them to then get rid of some of that heat a little better. So smaller amounts of mass, smaller masses are going to exchange heat a little more easily with the environment than larger massed animals and organisms. So that's going to affect the adaptations an organism needs to survive. Then let's talk metabolic rate really quick. So the metabolic rate is how many calories you need, or the amount of energy you need for an organism to function. And that can vary depending on what the organism is doing. You have like a resting metabolic rate, then you have one with activity. Notice in this graph that the metabolic rate actually does go up when an organism is bigger, but that's the total metabolic usage for that organism, not something we're going to talk about on the next slide. This reflects the speed at which chemical reactions are happening in the body. Well, it turns out when you have smaller organisms, they tend to have higher metabolic rates per unit of body mass. So they may not be taking in as many calories total, but per unit of mass, their metabolic rate is actually much higher. So here we have a small little mouse. It's not exactly a mouse, but it's got a tiny mass of 35 grams, and its metabolic rate is 890 cubic millimeters of oxygen per gram of body mass per hour. We use oxygen usage as an indicator of how much cell respiration is happening, just because oxygen is used up during that. And notice it's per gram of body mass. Whereas when we look at an elephant, which is much more massive, it's 4,500,000 grams. Keep in mind that's grams. Grams are tiny. And it's got a metabolic rate that's much lower of 75. This tends to also help compensate for the fact that, when you're a smaller organism, you're going to lose more heat because you have that higher surface area to volume ratio. So to compensate for that, your body's burning more calories to produce more heat to keep your internal temperature constant. All right, and there is my own large animal eating me, and we have next some more lessons on the cell membrane and membrane.